The morning fog drifted across the coastal town like a living, breathing veil, softening edges, blurring rooftops, and wrapping the quiet streets in a hush that always seemed to arrive before Clara did. She moved through it the way one walks through memory, carefully, almost reverently, as if the mist itself might reveal something she wasn't ready to see. Ever since heartbreak had carved its slow, invisible wound inside her, Clara had built her life on the safety of routine, the same path to the library, the same whispered greetings to early visitors, the same comforting weight of books that asked nothing of her except to be cared for. In this predictable rhythm, she had found a kind of stillness, even if it sometimes resembled loneliness far too closely. That morning, however, something shifted. The library's head archivist asked her to restore a forgotten section in the far corner, a place where dust had grown thick enough to seem almost intentional. Clara hesitated, not out of reluctance, but because she had always sensed a strange solemnity in that neglected alcove, as though the books stored there belonged more to time than to people. She knelt beside the lower shelves, brushing away layers of dust that rose in soft clouds around her, catching the muted light that filtered through fog-stained windows. One book, wedged tightly between two others, resisted being pulled free, and when she finally worked it loose, something slipped from inside and fluttered to the floor like a small, startled bird. It was a letter, folded precisely, edges softened with age. The paper trembled faintly in her hands, as though carrying the breath of the person who once wrote it. She unfolded it slowly, expecting perhaps a misplaced bookmark or an inventory note. But instead, she found words written in a tender, aching script that made her heart tighten in an unfamiliar way. I write to you because silence is a kind of death, and I have died too many small deaths already. She read the line again, then again, feeling the room draw closer around her. The rest of the letter unfurled into a confession so intimate, so trembling with longing and unspoken loss, that Clara felt as though she had wandered into a moment never meant to be witnessed. The author spoke of fog-laced mornings on the pier, of waiting for someone whose absence hollowed the world, and of love that persisted even when hope thinned to a thread. There was no signature, no address, no clue beyond emotion itself. When she finally looked up, the library felt different, heavier, yet strangely alive. She should have returned the letter to the file cart, cataloged it, and moved on. But instead, she folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket, unable to leave it behind. All day, she found her thoughts circling back to the voice in the ink, a voice that felt both raw and impossibly gentle. By the time she closed the library for the evening, dusk had descended, and fog was settling over the harbor like a ghostly quilt. Clara walked to the pier without fully deciding to. Something in the letter, a description of how the sea looked when the world loses its color and keeps only its ache, pulled her there, compelling her to stand where the author once stood. The air tasted of salt and memory. Ships moaned softly in the distance, and as she wrapped her coat tighter around herself, she felt an unfamiliar stirring inside her chest. Not fear, not hope, but the quiet sense that her life, long dormant, had begun to tilt towards something unknown. She whispered into the mist without meaning to, her voice almost lost to the tide. "Who wrote you?" There was no answer, only fog shifting gently, as though inviting her deeper into the story she had just stepped into. And Clara, unaware of how profoundly it would change her life, took another step along the pier, into the mystery, into the past, and into the beginning of a truth long buried beneath the fog. The next morning arrived wrapped in the same soft haze that clung to the town like a second skin, as if the world had not fully decided to wake. Clara moved through the library with an unusual restlessness, her thoughts looping back to the letter she had read so many times during the night that the words now felt etched behind her eyelids. She had placed the fragile paper beneath a stack of notebooks on her bedside table, afraid to damage it, yet more afraid of what it might begin unraveling inside her. The tenderness of the writing lingered in her like a haunting melody, one she did not know how to quiet. As she resumed sorting the forgotten shelves, she kept expecting to feel the same stillness that usually accompanied her work, but anticipation, subtle and persistent, hummed beneath everything she touched. It felt as though the letter had unsettled something dormant in her, a curiosity she hadn't felt since before her heart broke, before she learned how easily love could fade into silence. And when, later that afternoon, another folded slip of paper slipped from the cracked spine of an old novel, she froze. Her breath caught, not from surprise but from recognition. Another letter. Another voice trembling across the distance of years. This one was shorter, but no less piercing. The author described standing on the abandoned pier at dawn, watching the fog swallow the horizon, and imagining that the woman he loved might step out of it as she once had, arriving like a breath I'd forgotten I needed. The longing in the words was so vivid that Clara felt the ache as though it were her own. She pressed the letter against her chest, unable to shake the sensation that these writings were calling her towards something, or someone, she had not yet understood. The fog thickened by evening, turning street lamps into soft halos and blurring the edges of the world. Clara left the library with the letters in her coat pocket, drawn once again toward the sea. The wooden planks of the pier creaked beneath her steps, each groan punctuating the quiet. And that was when she saw him for the first time. A figure standing at the end of the pier, shoulders slightly bowed, hands in his pockets, as if he had been carved directly from the fog. He didn't turn at first. The sea wind lifted the edges of his coat, and the faintest outline of breath escaped him like smoke. Clara hesitated, her instincts warring between approaching him and drifting back into anonymity. But something about the man, his stillness, his isolation, the invisible weight he seemed to carry, made her take a single step forward. The board beneath her foot groaned, and he turned. His face was gentle, yet marked by something sorrowful, as though life had taken more from him than it had given. His eyes, a muted gray blue, regarded her with guarded curiosity. There was no fear, only a quietness that mirrored her own. "You come here often," he said softly, voice shaped by the tide, low, steady, tinged with solitude. Clara startled. No, not really. I just needed some air." His gaze drifted past her to the fog-covered sea, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable, as though the fog itself held space for their hesitation. Finally he murmured, "The pier is honest at this hour. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." She studied him, sensing layers beneath every word. Grief, perhaps, or longing still warm despite the years. Something in him felt familiar, though she could not place why. "I'm Elias," he added quietly, the name carried away by wind as soon as he spoke it. Clara felt her heartbeat stumble, not from recognition, but from instinct, the sense that this man existed near the very core of the story she had begun to uncover. "I'm Clara," she replied. Their eyes met again, and for a fleeting moment she felt suspended between past and present, between her life as it had been and whatever this unexpected encounter could become. The fog curled gently around them, blurring the world into soft silhouettes, pressing them into a moment neither had asked for, but both, somehow, needed. Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever write? Letters, I mean." Elias inhaled sharply, so subtly she almost doubted she heard it. The expression in his eyes flickered, shifting from curiosity to something unreadable, something deeper. "Not anymore," he answered, though the words felt like a truth wrapped in a lie. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet, a quiet, trembling beginning. And before she could ask anything more, the fog thickened once again, softly swallowing the distance between them and the questions she was suddenly afraid to voice. The morning after meeting Elias, Clara woke with the uneasy feeling that part of her had remained on the fog-draped pier, suspended in the quiet space where his eyes had held hers. She moved through her small kitchen as though sleepwalking, replaying the cadence of his voice, trying to decipher the emotion beneath his guarded words. There had been something there, a tremor, a shadow, that connected too easily with the fragments of longing she had read in the hidden letters. And yet, she told herself, it was impossible. The letters were decades old, their ink softened by time. They belonged to a man who had loved long before Clara was even born. Still, a whisper of possibility clung to her like mist on her sleeves. At the library, she settled into the quiet rhythm of cataloging books, but her attention splintered every time her hand brushed an old spine, each touch accompanied by a flicker of anticipation. She found herself scanning the shelves as though expecting another letter to fall at her feet, as though the universe had begun speaking to her in paper and ink. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that she noticed a slight bulge in the cover of an anthology of coastal poetry. Her pulse quickened. She opened it carefully, almost reverently, and there it was. Another folded page. Another message from the past reaching directly into her present. This letter was more intimate than the others, written in a hand that shook slightly, as though the writer's emotions had trembled through the pen. He wrote of a promise made on a foggy morning, a vow to meet the woman he loved at the pier before the fog lifted. He described waiting, heart in my throat, breath held hostage, believing she would step out of the mist as she always had. But she never came. The letter ended abruptly, as if the moment he realized she wasn't returning shattered the words mid-sentence. Clara pressed her fingers to her lips, overwhelmed by the rawness of the grief contained in those unfinished lines. Her hands trembled as she placed the letter on her desk. Each discovery pulled her deeper into a story she couldn't walk away from, even as she sensed the emotional danger of becoming tangled in another person's heartbreak. Yet she felt compelled, by empathy, by curiosity, and by the strange certainty that the letters were meant to be found now, at this stage of her own healing. She wondered if Elias ever stood on that pier, remembering the promise, if he carried the ache of that broken morning in the quiet way he held himself. As evening descended, Clara found herself once more drawn to the shoreline, as though the tide itself tugged her forward. The fog rolled in early, thicker than the night before, and she paused on the path leading to the water. Elias was already there, his figure barely visible through the shifting gray. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, staring into the expanse as though trying to read something written in the mist. Clara approached quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever fragile thought held him. "You came back," he murmured without turning, as though he had known she was there before she made a sound. "I suppose I did," she answered, her breath creating a brief halo in the cold air. He looked at her then, and she saw something new in his expression. Not curiosity, but recognition, a knowing she couldn't yet decipher. "Do you believe," Elias asked softly, "that some memories stay alive even when everything around them fades?" Clara's heart tightened. "I think some memories refuse to sleep." Their eyes held for a long, quiet moment. Clara felt as though she were tipping forward, drawn into a truth she hadn't yet learned, but somehow already feared. Elias exhaled shakily, his gaze drifting back toward the fog. "There are things we carry," he said, "that we never mean to burden others with." Clara's fingers brushed the pocket where she had placed the newly discovered letter. Her voice quivered. "Sometimes the weight becomes lighter when it's shared." He closed his eyes, as if the idea pained him. "Or heavier," he whispered. Silence stretched between them, tender and charged, until the fog parted just enough for the moon to glow faintly above the water. Clara felt the shift in the air, the unmistakable sensation that she stood at the early edge of something irreversible. She considered showing him the letter, offering it as a bridge, but fear held her still. Fear of breaking whatever fragile thread was forming between them. Fear of the truth that might come rushing in. Instead, she stepped beside him, shoulder to shoulder, letting the quiet become their language. And in that moment, beneath a sky softened by moonlit mist, she realized that the letters were no longer just pieces of someone else's past. They were becoming the key to her own. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, delicate quiet, as if the fog itself had learned to move more slowly around Clara and Elias, listening for the words they would not yet speak. Clara found herself drifting through her routines in a state of heightened awareness, sensing Elias in the spaces he had touched with his presence: the pier, the narrow path along the dunes, the corner of the library where he paused to read the newspaper without ever borrowing it. Every encounter between them, whether accidental or half-intended, carried a charged softness, a hovering possibility, as though both were circling a truth too fragile to confront directly. Yet beneath that gentleness simmered tension, a subtle quickening of breath whenever their gazes held too long, whenever Elias shifted away just as Clara instinctively leaned closer. At the library, as Clara catalogued a stack of old maritime journals, she kept glancing at the drawer where she had hidden the letters. Their presence felt almost alive, a quiet heartbeat beneath the polished wood, urging her toward a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to name. She found herself rereading the final, unfinished letter late at night, tracing her fingers over the abrupt ending, imagining the man writing it, ink trembling, hope collapsing under the weight of disappointment. And every time, her thoughts drifted to Elias, the way he watched the horizon as though expecting something to emerge from it, the way sorrow lived in the shadows of his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking, as if afraid his voice would betray a history she had not yet earned the right to hear. One afternoon, as heavy fog pressed low over the town, Clara ventured to the pier, hoping to clear her mind, but instead found Elias standing by the railing, his silhouette dissolving into the gray. She hesitated, then approached quietly. He did not turn as she arrived beside him, but she sensed a shift in his breath, not surprise, but acknowledgement. For a long moment they simply stood there, the sound of the waves lapping softly against the wooden pylons beneath them, the fog cooling their cheeks in gentle strokes. Clara felt the question rising in her chest like an ache. She longed to ask him about the woman in the letters, about the promise that was never fulfilled, about the grief he carried like a shadow stitched to his ribs. But Elias spoke first. "There are places," he murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon, "where the past clings tighter than the present." His voice was low, haunted, as if dragged from a depth he rarely allowed himself to touch. Sometimes it feels as though the fog remembers more than I do. Clara's heart tightened. She wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but something in his posture, the rigidity of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched the railing, warned her that this was a precipice too delicate to cross uninvited. Instead, she asked softly, "Is that why you come here? To remember? Or to forget?" His breath hitched, barely perceptible. "To forgive," he whispered. Those two words fell between them like stones sinking into deep water. Clara felt the impact ripple through her. Forgiveness was not something she had ever associated with the letters, which spoke of love, devotion, loss. Hearing it now reshaped her understanding, as though a veil had lifted and revealed a darker contour beneath. She turned slightly toward him. "Forgive whom?" Elias exhaled, long and uneven. "Myself," he said, and finally met her gaze. The rawness there unsettled her. It was not the sadness of a man abandoned. It was the grief of someone who believed they had failed, someone who had lived with the echo of a moment they could never rewrite. Clara's breath trembled. Every instinct urged her to show him the letters, to bridge the distance that stretched painfully between them. But fear coiled around her heart. Fear that revealing them would unravel something sacred, or worse, reopen wounds he had barely learned to live with. Instead, she touched the railing beside his hand, not touching him, but close enough that warmth could cross the narrow space between them. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she said gently. His eyes softened with something like longing, but he looked away as though the emotion pained him. "Some burdens lose their shape if spoken aloud," he murmured. "I'm not sure I'm ready to see what remains." The fog thickened around them, muffling the world into a muted gray cocoon. Clara felt the moment closing like a fragile shell. She understood that Elias was on the edge of revealing something deeper, something essential, yet he could not step across that threshold, not yet. And she, holding a truth of her own, could not push him forward without risking everything they were beginning to build. So she stood beside him, breathing the same cold air, sharing the same silence, knowing that transparency was coming, inevitable, luminous, and possibly devastating. But not today. As they parted at the end of the pier, Clara sensed a subtle shift in the wind, a reminder that the fog would not hide their truths forever. The letters were waking, and soon so would the past. The storm arrived without warning. Not the violent kind that tears branches from trees, but a heavy, low-rolling coastal fog that swallowed the town by mid-evening, muffling every sound until the world felt suspended in a breathless hush. Clara stood in the library long after closing, the last lamp casting a soft amber halo over the desk where the letters lay spread before her like delicate wounds. Her hands trembled as she traced the edges of the final envelope, the one she had never dared to open until now. Inside, she found words written decades ago, but pulsing with a pain that felt immediate, alive. A confession of love intertwined with despair, a promise too fragile to survive the weight of silence, and a plea that the woman he loved might someday understand what he could not bring himself to say aloud. Clara felt the truth coil through her like a slow, devastating flame. There was no longer any room for doubt. Elias had written these letters, and the woman who vanished had broken him in ways he still carried like a shadow stitched to his heart. She knew then that keeping his secret safe from him was no longer an act of protection, but of fear, her fear, and that the fragile bond forming between them could not grow in the dark. So she slipped the letters into her coat and stepped out into the night, letting the fog wrap around her as she made her way toward the pier where he often walked when the world grew too heavy. The wooden planks were slick beneath her boots, shimmering faintly under the soft glow of lanterns blurred into golden orbs. And there he was, standing at the edge, unmoving, as if listening to the rhythm of the sea through the dense gray silence. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, Clara saw at once that he had been crying, not openly, but in the subtle shine along his lashes, the exhausted slope of his shoulders. "Clara," he breathed, voice strained, as though he had been rehearsing her name for hours. "I didn't expect—" She stepped closer, heart hammering with an ache she could no longer contain. "I found something," she whispered, her voice fragile but steady. "Something you left behind a long time ago." His gaze fell instantly to the envelopes in her hand. For a moment he simply stared, the fog curling around them like a living thing. His face shifted, shock, fear, recognition, and then a deep, wrenching sorrow that seemed to hollow the space between them. "You shouldn't have read those," he murmured, the words breaking apart in his throat. Clara shook her head, tears gathering. "They were never meant to be lost. And they aren't just love letters, Elias. They're pieces of you. Pieces you buried because you thought no one could hold them without shattering." He closed his eyes, the pain radiating from him like a tremor. "They were for someone who is gone," he said quietly. "Someone I could never reach again. I wrote them to keep myself from falling apart, but when she left, the words stopped mattering." Clara felt the crack in her heart widen, not out of jealousy, but empathy. "She didn't leave because of you," she whispered. "She left because she was broken in ways she didn't know how to explain. Those letters, they were her last connection to hope. And she failed you by running from the truth instead of trusting you with it." His eyes opened, raw and searching. "How can you know that?" She swallowed hard, knowing the next words would change everything. "Because I know what it feels like to leave someone without saying why. I know the shame, the fear, the helplessness of wanting to protect them from a part of you that feels too dark to share." Her voice cracked. "Elias, I understand her." The fog deepened, pressing the moment into sharp relief. Elias took a small step back, as if her confession had knocked the breath from him. "Clara," he whispered, "are you trying to tell me you've lived this pain?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm trying to tell you that your letters didn't make me fall in love with your past. They made me see your heart, the heart you still have, even if you've convinced yourself it belongs to another lifetime." Silence pooled between them, heavy, sacred. Elias reached out, fingertips brushing the envelopes as though they were made of glass. "I can't lose someone again," he said, voice trembling. "You don't understand what it did to me, how long it took just to breathe normally again." Clara stepped closer until their breaths mingled in the cool air. "Then don't lose me," she whispered. "Not to your past, not to your fear. I'm right here, in the present, and I'm not her. I won't disappear into the fog." For the first time since she met him, Elias let the truth show in his face, the longing, the fear, the desire to believe her. His gaze dropped to the final unopened letter, still trembling in her hand. Slowly, with a reverence that echoed through the air, he lifted it. "This one," he said softly, "I never had the courage to read. It felt like the end." Clara took his hand. "Maybe it can be a beginning." Elias hesitated, then placed the letter against his chest, eyes closing as if releasing decades of grief with a single exhale. And in that fragile space, suspended between confession and rebirth, the fog began to thin. Morning crept into the town on soft feet, washing the coastline in pale silver light that slowly warmed into gold, dissolving the last remnants of the night's fog. Clara awoke with the imprint of the previous evening still lingering in her chest, not as fear, but as a tender ache, the kind that signals a heart learning its new shape. She walked toward the pier with cautious hope, each breath crisp against her skin, each step carrying both doubt and anticipation. The sea was calm now, a glass-like expanse reflecting the awakening sky, and for a moment she wondered whether Elias would come at all, whether the fragile peace they reached in the fog might shatter in daylight. But then she saw him, standing at the very edge of the pier, the unopened letter clasped gently in his hands, sunlight glinting off the paper like a quiet blessing. He did not turn as she approached, but his shoulders softened at the sound of her footsteps, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was welcome here. Clara stopped beside him, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them, not as a barrier, but as a space they now shared. The letter, that fragile remnant of a love bound in sorrow, looked different in the morning light, less like a wound, more like a memory ready to be laid to rest. Elias gazed down at it, and for a moment his voice trembled with the weight of decades. "I read it," he said softly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It wasn't a goodbye. It was an apology and a hope. She wanted me to be loved again. She wanted me to live." Clara felt emotion rise in her throat, not jealousy, but a gentle, aching compassion. She had feared the past would always outshine whatever future they might build. Yet here, in this fragile dawn, she saw him as he truly was, a man no longer trapped between loyalty and loss, but beginning to reclaim the power to choose. "She was part of your story," Clara whispered, "but you don't have to stay inside that chapter forever." Elias turned to her then, really looking at her, and she saw tears in his eyes, not of despair, but release. "I'm tired of living in the fog," he murmured. "I want something I can touch, something alive." With slow, deliberate motions, he lifted the letter to his lips, pressing it there in a final gesture of gratitude and farewell. Then, with Clara's hand lightly resting against his arm, he let it fall into the sea. The envelope drifted for a moment, rocking gently on the rippling water before the tide carried it away, dissolving the last tether that held him to grief. For a long time they stood like that, watching the paper fade into the morning light, until it became indistinguishable from the shimmering expanse. When he finally turned toward her, his expression had softened into something vulnerable, honest, and alive. "Clara," he said, her name a breath of warmth against the cool air. "I don't know how to start again, but I want to try. With you." She stepped closer, placing her hand against his chest where the letter had rested moments before, feeling the steady rhythm of a heart learning how to open. "Then we don't start at all," she murmured, eyes meeting his. "We continue." The words settled between them like a promise, not dramatic or grand, but steady, sincere, exactly what their fractured histories needed. Elias took her hand, intertwining their fingers with a care that made her breath catch, and together they began walking back along the pier. The fog had lifted entirely now, revealing gulls sweeping across a sky washed clean, and the small town stirring with morning life. Yet for Clara, the most striking transformation was inside her. The realization that she no longer felt the weight of solitude pressing on her ribs, but a new, gentle fullness expanding in its place. As they reached the shore, Elias paused, looking out over the brightening sea. "You found those letters by accident," he said quietly, "but maybe you were meant to find me." Clara felt her heart tremble with something both terrifying and beautiful. "Maybe we were meant to find each other," she replied, letting the truth of the words rise between them like sunlight breaking through the last veil of cloud. And so the story closed, not with certainty, not with perfection, but with courage. Two wounded souls choosing to walk forward, together, into a world no longer shrouded in fog. The past had not vanished, nor had the sorrow within it, but the weight was finally shared, halved, softened by the presence of another heart willing to carry it. And as the morning light spread across the coast, bright and tender and full of possibility, Clara and Elias stepped into the day, hand in hand, no longer afraid of what came next.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, even quietly, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us create more slow, emotional love stories like this one. New stories are coming soon,